Jesus himself said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Whoever believes in me, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciple, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." This is who Jesus said he is. Do you believe him?
Well, welcome to Flatiron. We are back in the John series, and we're going to be dealing with kind of an interesting topic today, a topic that centers around the idea of mistrust. But before I do so, I want to give a shout out. Yesterday we had our men's event, and I think we had like 50 or so guys come out to this event. So just a quick round of applause for the men getting up, going Saturday morning, some of them there at 7 to cook food for the others that were actually going to hike. It was kind of cool. We had two groups, very distinct groups, those who wanted to climb the mountain and those who just wanted to sit at base camp, making the food, eating the food, talking about the food. But if you missed it, we're going to hopefully do another one here in April, and you're like, "Oh, I'm not a hiker." Well, that's great. There's a whole group of guys that didn't hike. They just sat there, and they had a lot of fun, and they engaged food, I think. So come out for that. And then the second thing is, about a year ago, we had an event that was called our We Are Flatiron event, and this is where I was at Rock Point Church, and I preached 5 services, and Bill came on stage, and basically we started to cast the vision for what this church would be, and prior to that, we had been meeting for about 4 months. We started as a Bible study in my house. We quickly grew outside of my house, went to a school, quickly outgrew that. We were running about 80 people, and then a year ago, this event happened. It was called our We Are Flatiron event. 320 people came out to that event, and our church went from 80 to 180 overnight. Just absolutely changed. Yeah, and so some of you guys, you were there. That was the moment you're like, I remember taking that first step. I remember coming into the community of Flatiron, and I remember feeling like this is home. And so it's odd to think, but there are plenty of people in here who you just came on your year anniversary of Flatiron Church. And I wanted to make that known. It's such a cool thing. There's others of you that once we get to our actual anniversary, the year anniversary from our grand opening, which will be in July, we'll have another event that we can celebrate. But quickly just wanted to make mention of that. Okay, as we dive into the text today, today's text is a little bit heavy, and it deals with the topic of mistrust and distrust. And so if you're not familiar with the topics of mistrust, we can move to just the standard slide, or else people are going to be looking at that more than the text. So here's what happens. In mistrust and distrust, you're going to have seasons where you have a tremendous amount of mistrust towards somebody. It's not necessarily wrong. It's something's happened, something's unfolded. But have you ever had those seasons where it happened to you? Have you ever had those seasons where you just kind of wake up, stumble in, and realize, wow, there's a lot of people that are mistrusting me? And there's moments where we can be like, I get it. I did something wrong. I wasn't faithful in this, or I wasn't truthful in this, or I wasn't honest in this, and therefore that mistrust is well placed. But have you ever had that mistrust displaced or not well placed? Somebody suspecting something of you, you didn't do it. Somebody's guilty, or they're thinking you're guilty of something, you're like, I didn't have a role in this. Okay, 2019, I was, kind of in that 6th year of ministry of pastoring, and I remember going through a subsequent health crisis. I've talked a lot about that on stage if you've been around for a while. Just some nerve pain. Didn't know it was nerve pain until months later. But I'm walking with decreased mobility in my left arm, and at that same time, there's kind of like something happening behind the scenes at our church. What's going on is I was our collegiate pastor, our college guy, and there was a group of people who were kind of feeding lies to my pastor about me. I didn't know about it. But over time, I'm talking like 6 months to a year, he's beginning to more and more and more and more believe the lies he's hearing. And he's not bringing them to me. And so all of a sudden, we get to the fall of 19. Melinda's like, who's my wife, she's like, when are you going to staff meeting? I was like, I don't know. I haven't been invited. She's like, don't you think that's weird? I was like, no, I think it's awesome. It's great. You know me in meetings, I don't like to have them unless I need to. And so for me, I was like, okay, well, but it did raise my suspicion. Then I got this really kind of odd email, and I was like, okay, this seems like they distrust me, but I'm not sure what's going on. And I gave it to her, and she read it, and she's like, this is an awful email. I was like, okay, trajectory's not going well. And then we get January of 2020. I get called into the elders, and I didn't realize it, but it was basically a panel to fire me. And it led to a 3-hour conversation with all of the guys just peppering me with questions. And the moment they started asking those questions, I was like, oh, this isn't a conversation, this is an inquisition. And in that moment, betrayal that comes to mind. In that moment, you feel like, how could you? But in that moment, truly, and I mean this honestly, because of where the Lord had brought me in my health, I was already so broken and beaten down, and I was just like, Lord, whatever you want to do. Whatever you want to do. Have you been there? Are you there today? Where just mistrust piles upon mistrust. And again, sometimes it's warranted. Sometimes it's not. And I'm talking about those seasons where it just feels like, how did I get here? And how do I get out? Big idea this morning is don't let mistrust, just general mistrust, misplace your trust in Jesus. It's really easy in those seasons when all of a sudden everything's just going haywire to lose focus that he still has it. That he's still in control, that he's still moving forward, that even if my control and my ability is shot and spent, his is not. And you think, I get that, I know that. You say that until you're in the season. You say that until all of a sudden the best friends have walked away. You say that until all of a sudden the spouse is signing papers and you had no idea. True story, though, it happens all the time. So where is mistrust happening in your life? Now, some of you, you're in here, you're not being mistrusted. You're the one actively fomenting or doing the mistrust. And sometimes for valid reasons. Sometimes not. The Word of God is going to appear in your heart. I can't, but the Word of God today is going to hopefully enlighten and show, kind of light up what is or isn't of Him. And my only ask today is that you come to the text humbly. Picking up here, we're going to be in chapter 7. We're going to walk through the first 13 verses and basically take verse to verse and see how this unfolds, this aspect of mistrust unfolds within the life of Jesus and what that means for us. Verse 1 begins, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. Probably thinking, what is the this here? The this on this is that he had been, feeding the 5,000. He then sails to the other side. He walks on the water to the other side. And then he's got this big confrontation where all the disciples, and again, that's not the 12, that's all the thousands of people who followed Jesus because he was doing miracles. They're there, and he has a big confrontation with them. And he effectively says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you're not with me, you're not in me. And most of the crowd disappears. They don't realize he's talking about the cross. They just simply get weirded out and they leave. Well, 6 months after this is when this takes place. And so he is now in that same region 6 months later, and it's called the Feast of Booths. He would not go about Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. So he was up in the northern reaches of Israel, the southern portion, which is where Jerusalem was, known as Judea. He wasn't going there yet because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Verse 2, now the Feast of Booths was at hand. What is the Feast of Booths? The Feast of Booths was set up during the time when Moses was bringing the Israelites out of Egypt. And effectively, it was set up as one of the 3 big festivals, holidays that the Israelites would celebrate. The first being Passover, when they were brought out of the land of Egypt. The Festival of Booths was it dealt with future restoration, and it dealt with kind of future provision. So just as God provided manna in the wilderness, the Feast of Booths was a time when that fulfillment of that would come. The fulfillment of provision and protection would come. It happened in the fall. So the Passover happens usually around April. Feast of Booths 6 months later happens around October. And that's when they start to harvest grapes for wine. And that's also when they harvest the olives. And so for the Israelites, this was their favorite festival. I'll let you fill in the blanks. But they really enjoyed this one. And so he's coming at a time where there's a lot of festivity. There's a lot of people coming in towards Jerusalem. And this is where the brothers are now going to engage him. So verse 3 picks up now the conflict. So his brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. Okay, Jesus had brothers. He had half-brothers and half-sisters through the line of Mary. And they were questioning him at this time. And this makes sense to a degree. He says, leave here, go to Judea, that your disciples may see the works you're doing. If you're reading that in a positive light, you're going to think, oh, cool, they're just kind of like, hey, go get your message out. Go ahead and just make yourself known. Go to Judea because there's more people there. Another way you could understand this is Jesus was hanging out in an area that was a lot less populated. He was kind of a big fish in a small pond. And the brothers are saying, hey, go to the bigger pond. Go to Jerusalem. Go down there. Now, don't you remember? Jesus says, I'm not going there yet because the Jews are seeking to kill me. And this is kind of that first aspect we see in the brothers of this kind of seed of mistrust. Seed of mistrust here. And I call that difference in perspective. I got that up here on the list. Common reasons for mistrust. Now, you're going to see that the brothers have full-blown mistrust. But they start off with something a little more innocuous. Hey, just if you're wanting to be big, Jesus, go down to Jerusalem and make yourself known. You could say maybe there's a difference of perspective here. They're seeing it one way. Jesus has already said, no, I'm not going down there. And sometimes those differences of perspective, they're just different ways we see things. As I was in that meeting with the elders, there were certain things as they would come up, I was like, oh, this is what that meant, or this is what was being said. And it was like, okay, just difference of perspective. Sometimes we're sitting with our spouse and we've got something that we're working on and they're like, hey, I think we need to bring the Cheez-Its. You're like, no, I think we need to bring popcorn. Total difference of perspective. Everyone knows Cheez-Its are right. Okay, but here's the thing. It's just difference of perspective. But these things layer. So you're going to see that verse 3 builds to verse 4, builds to verse 5. Difference of perspective isn't bad. Difference of perspective, the thing you have to do is just make sure you work it out. You engage the conflict. Conflict isn't bad. One of the greatest lies perpetrated on the church is that all conflict is sinful. Not all conflict is sinful. Conflict means you're actually having an honest conversation. That's the method with which you can engage in honest conversation. Now, there's bad conflict and there's good conflict. There's bad ways to do conflict and there's good ways to do conflict, but conflict in and of itself, not bad. Engaging the different principles. Most of the time this happens for my wife and I when we're going on a road trip. Invariably, the way we prepare for road trips is vastly different. She's thoughtful. She's getting everything packed. I'm like, we got 10 minutes? Great. I'm going to do taxes right now. No joke. Something about it. I don't know. When I've got urgency, it's like that gets me focused. It's the ADD in me. I'm confident of it, and more so now than I ever was, that when I have a stress in front of me, it focuses me like no other. This drives Melinda through a wall. Because all of a sudden she's like, I've prepared and planned, and now you're in the office trying to get stuff done. We're leaving. Okay, difference of perspective. Mine's probably wrong on that one. Just have the conflict, engage it. But here's the thing, all jokes aside, if we don't do this, let me show you where it leads. So verse 4, I'm going to add this to verse 3 now. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Now, if you're reading this and you're trying to give the most benefit of the doubt to the brothers, you could say it's still just a difference of perspective. But let me go ahead and fill a few things in here that kind of tilt this towards, in my opinion, a little bit deeper level of mistrust. No one works in secret, which means they're effectively saying, hey, you're working in secret here. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. If you're really this, you'd probably be in a bigger pond. You'd probably have a bigger following. You'd probably be in the cities. There's a hint of what I call suspicion. Verse 4 leads me down that pathway where we started with difference in perspectives, and now we've moved to suspicion. The brothers, and what are they suspicious of? They think he's just trying to make a name for himself. They see the miracles. He's healed people, but they don't believe him. Okay, suspicion for you and me. If we don't engage conflict, if we don't engage difference in perspective, it will eventually lead to suspicion. And here's what suspicion is. Suspicion is thinking of someone, assuming they're going to do the wrong thing before they've done it. Suspicion is thinking of someone, assuming they're going to do the wrong thing before they have done it. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. Have you ever been suspicious? You're like, yes, right here, right there. Some of you, you're pointing to me. Pastors, preachers, teachers, you're like, I've got a great suspicion. I've seen abuse, I've seen hurt, I've seen waywardness, I don't even know. And here's the thing, I have too. In that moment when I got pulled before all the elders of the church and they started peppering me with questions, what I realized is it wasn't just difference of perspectives, it was ultimate suspicion. Things were being read, lenses were being applied to my actions that assumed I was trying to do something I wasn't. The big threat they thought is that I was trying to take over the church. I was like, you already know I'm going to plant. Why would I take over this? But if you allow suspicion to start to burrow down in your heart, you're not asking questions anymore. And this is the first sign you've got suspicion is you walk in the room, or that person walks in the room, or their name gets brought up, and the temperature changes in your heart. Have you ever had that moment? You're like, happens at life group. Okay, time to talk. Time to talk. Conflict is also, again, not the enemy here. It's the way you push in. Are the suspicions true? Are they true? But use this as an identifier. If somebody's name is brought up or they come into the room and the temperature changes in your heart, usually there's suspicion. That's normally not just a difference in perspective. It's moved down to suspicion. And the problem with suspicion is it's almost impossible for that person to prove you wrong. It's almost impossible. If you're thinking, man, they're always this way, they're probably doing something that lends itself to that. And you'll constantly apply that lens. And it becomes dangerous in marriages, in families, and in church. Marriages, all of a sudden your spouse, they're not just wrong, they're not just different from you, they're kind of the enemy. They kind of are always doing these things. They're purposely trying to hurt me. They're purposely against me. Kids. Suspicion with kids. Man, kids are going to give you plenty of ammo. They're born sus. That's what the kids call it these days. They are. They are. And your heart goes out for them, but you're like, man, I feel like you're playing me, and you might be playing me, but I still love you, and I don't know how to do this. And then sometimes families break, and they're, hey, we're not talking, and it's been 10 years, 15 years. That's my family story. Pacheco's, we're notorious for blowing up at each other and then never talking. And if you go back throughout the years of my family, you'll see it all over the place. There is distrust, mistrust, big argument, and then no more conversation. You also see it in church with the pastor, but you see it a lot within life groups and people too. Here's the thing, and this is where it gets really tricky. You're like, well, Brian, there's reasons for that. Sometimes somebody did something wrong. Sometimes they stated something that's not true. Sometimes they did a behavior that needs to be called out. Sometimes they acted in a manner that's not safe for the community. And I agree. My point of this is don't let mistrust make you trust people. My point is don't let mistrust misplace your trust in Jesus. And here's why this is so important. If you go through life thinking, I'm just going to make sure I'm never around people that I mistrust or distrust, you're never going to be around anybody, including yourself. The second thing is that Jesus puts us back on mission with people that are potentially dangerous. He does. That doesn't mean, hey, give them the access code to your house, right? Don't do that. Don't be foolish. But sometimes we start to blend that line or blur that line of what's foolish and what's prudent. If prudence to you looks like I am only around those I trust, it's going to be really hard to do Jesus' mission. And here's where some of your personalities, you're more type A, you're more bold, I was in a military family. My dad taught me from a young age, don't trust people. That's what he taught me. And he saw it because he saw what could happen. If you mistrust the wrong person, it could totally derail your career. It could shoot you badly in the foot. The issue I saw is over the years, as he applied that more and more in his life, he got more and more closed off. And even he would say that. It's like, I kind of took that too far. We can't allow mistrust, even if it's real, to allow us to mistrust that God sometimes uses us in those situations. And if we don't do this, then here's what tends to happen. Verse 5. For not even his brothers believed in him. Now take a look at this. They started with difference of perspective. Lower, lower, lower. Got to suspicion. Lower, lower, lower. Pure unbelief. How does this work for us? It tends to be suspicion, or difference in perspective, suspicion, distrust. You're like, well, what's the difference between mistrust and distrust? There's a huge difference. Mistrust is you're still in the place of gathering information. Can I trust you? You don't seem trustworthy, but I'm not sure. I haven't made the final decision. Distrust is, I need to be aware because you are not a safe person. Mistrust, gathering information, not sure, going to be cautious. Distrust, closed wall. And I've seen it a lot, but basically if churches don't fight against the mistrust, a culture of mistrust, it's going to be a church of distrust. And the people of distrust aren't on mission because they're too worried about getting hurt from their backside or their left side or their right. Have you ever been there? And here's the lie we believe. Well, I just need to get around better people. I just need to find a church that doesn't have all those distrusting people. You and me are the problem. Do you not see that? You and me are the problem. None of us is righteous. None. That's why a healthy culture is not a culture without conflict. It is a culture with conflict that's moving towards understanding. And none of this will work if we don't have Jesus at the head. And here's why. Look at what he says. Verse 6. Jesus says to them, this is his brothers, by the way. He says, my time has not yet come, but your time is always here. That seems cryptic until we read verse 7. Verse 7 says, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. When John began his gospel, he started with light and darkness. And he said light was coming into the world, and it was showing the world for what it was. It was revealing the world for what is. It was telling the world this is truth. Jesus comes in, and he reveals what is true. There's no hiding. There's no pretense. There's no getting around it. What he reveals is true. And as Jesus enters into our community, light begins to show what is and what isn't. But if you're not part of Jesus, you're always in darkness. If you're not part of Jesus, there is no, we're going to move forward in truth. There's only mistrust. In verse 6, when it says, his time had yet not come, but your time is always here, whenever Jesus is using time in the Gospel of John, to time or hour refers to the moment of him being on the cross. Time refers to this specific season, these last 3 years of his public ministry, where he is doing the Father's will and bidding in a very intense manner. Effectively, he is moving when God calls him to move. He is resting when God calls him to rest. He is pushing in when God calls him to push in. He is stopping when God calls him to stop. He is acting in accordance with the Father. But he looks at his brothers and he says, while mine is delineated, you're not, because you are your own master. My time is specific. Yours is not, because effectively you are still of the kingdom of darkness. You are still your own. If you don't know Jesus, the best you have is mistrust and distrust, or people just like you. In the kingdom of Jesus, it allows you to engage people, those you may trust, those who may not be trustworthy, with prudence and eyes, but also a trust knowing that he has it, that he's in control. That even if somebody gets something on you, gets something over you, takes advantage, that Jesus hasn't changed, that Jesus is still king, that Jesus is still good. Do you see the difference here? If you are living in darkness unto yourself, you will not have anything but mistrust and distrust. You won't. You can't. If you're a Christian in Christ, you have the temptation to live here. You can distrust and mistrust everyone, or you can live in the freedom knowing, Lord, you put me on mission around people that are like me and not like me. I'm going to trust in you that no matter what happens, you're going to protect me. In that moment when I'm sitting before these 7 guys, and they have nothing but suspicion and nothing but disbelief, I want to tell you that it was my strength that brought me through that moment, but it wasn't. It was my weakness that brought me through that moment. The health craziness had already lowered me to just nothing. I was nothing but a puddle on the floor. And I'm thankful for that, because had I been in my own strength, I'm sure I would have tried to fight to prove myself to be true, to prove myself to be right, to take things in my hands and say, no, this is wrong. You're being suspicious. But because I didn't have energy or strength of mind or any of that, I just sat there and took it. And all I had was, Jesus, you've got to come through. And you're either going to come through in my firing, or you're going to come through and reveal truth while they're here. And I trusted either way he was going to take care. And one by one, you could tell an elder would start to shift off of a topic. And all of a sudden another one. And by the end of that 3-hour meeting, I knew the elders believed me. It was the pastor that didn't. And I couldn't change his mind. I couldn't change his heart. Where are you today? Where you're fighting. Oh, everything in you is fighting. And you can point to me, Pastor, but they've really done things here, and they've really done things here, and this is how I'm being misused and mistreated, and this is all the accusations. And I'm not going to look at you and say, go ahead and trust them. Now I'm going to say, trust Jesus. Can he work in and through that? And what has he called you, servant? But to trust him. To trust him. And then the specifics will come in. Well, then what am I supposed to do with somebody that's untrustworthy? You act with wisdom and grace. Wisdom means, hey, I'm not going to bring you into the inner circle because you're untrustworthy. But I am going to pursue you in a manner that means that you still are human. Grace, I'm going to meet you with an understanding that God reached out to me when I was so far opposed to him. But that doesn't just mean I act as though nothing's wrong. Wisdom and grace. And what I'm saying, Christian, is that you stand near Jesus. He gives you both. That's what leaks off of him. And it's going to allow you to navigate those difficult challenges within your life, those difficult challenges within this church. Big idea. Don't let mistrust misplace your trust in Jesus. It's not, don't let mistrust misplace your trust in people. It's Jesus. And if you're so far with me, you're like, okay, I get it now, that my distrust of God is actually what's leading me on distrust with people, or my distrust with God is what's causing me that when I'm with distrustful people, what I'm trying to do is wall myself off. But how do I move forward in this? What does that even look like? Verse 8 and 9, look at what Jesus says to his brothers. He says, you go up to the feast. He's talking to his brothers. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. And after saying this, he remained in Galilee. Here's the crazy thing about this, is when you read it on first glance, you're thinking, okay, well, I guess Jesus isn't going to this party. He doesn't care about it. But look with me in verse 8 again. It says, I am not going up to this feast, but I am going to another. When he uses the word this feast, he's not talking about, I'm not going to go to that feast. He says, I'm not going to this one. Well, why? What did the Feast of Booths point to? A future reality when God's provision would be unending. When the manna that rained from heaven would no longer just wilt and rot in the desert, but it would sustain. When the waters wouldn't just come out of the rock periodically, but it would fulfill forever. It's pointing to Jesus. The feast, the true feast, the feast that never ends. Jesus isn't going up to the feast because he's the feast. He is the feast. He's the fulfillment of it. You eat of him, you drink of him, you are never hungry and you will never thirst. What fear do I have at that moment? That someone might betray me. What fear do I have at that moment? That someone might use me. What fear do I have at that moment? That someone might get one over on me when the King of Kings has brought me to his own and already showed me I am his inheritance. Jesus is the better feast. Christian, you and I We'll believe Jesus, but we'll live like we don't know him if we fail to see him as the better feast. If we fail to see that he provides for the needs, that he gives the provision, that even in those moments where we feel like we can be abused, misused, and mistreated, that he stands firm with us. And this is so far afield from the gospel of prosperity today that some of you are probably thinking, I'm just crazy up here. But what I'm trying to do is prepare you for good works that the Lord has given. Because the church in America is dying, and one of the reasons it's dying is because Christians stopped believing that Jesus was better. They stopped believing. And they started assuming that as long as I have things in comfort around me when I want them, then I know I'm on the right path. No, brother and sister, the path is with him. And just so you know, he died on a cross. Is he worth it? Is he worth it? If he is, that he will place you around people that you're going to have to navigate with wisdom and grace. Come on. Some of you, you're not in life groups because you don't like the people in your life group. I'm not saying that they're easy to like. I might even agree with you. I'm glad I'm not in that group. It's a tough cookie. Now, does that mean you immediately pull out? No. Push in for a season. If the Lord is making it very clear, hey, yeah, I think we're just better separate, there's no harm in that either. But it's the immediacy of our rejection to things that are difficult. Marriages. We think the moment we come across choppy water, something's wrong. It shouldn't be this way. If we were really meant to be together, it should be easy. I don't know where that idea came from. That's insane. If your thought process, I stay in my marriage because I feel the butterflies, you're a fool with a capital F. And I'm sorry that your parents or somebody else didn't mentor you or train you. Your kids. Some of you guys, there's two ways you can go on this. You can go with your children where you think, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and affirm everything about them. Wrong. You can't. There's yours to disciple and train, to raise up, and at some point they go off on their own. And at that point in time, you're no longer having the same authority in their life. You're having the ability to leverage influence. But you have to let them go. The other side of that coin is you totally cut off from them. No, we're done. I'm not doing anything part because, and I would say, look at what, this is a parable and this might take me a little bit upfield, but the parable that Jesus uses of God the Father is when there's two sons and one of them's younger, takes the money and runs away to a foreign country. Totally squanders it on reckless living and everything else that's debaucherous. He comes back and God the Father receives him. You can't force your kids to come back, but do you have a posture in your heart that says, I will receive you? Doesn't mean I'm affirming it. But none of these things will happen if we don't believe Jesus is the better feast. And here's the reality. As I can tell you all this, you have to respond though. You do. And there's three responses that we're going to see coming straight from the text. Verse 10. But after his brothers had gone to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. Jesus has taken the shadow side of things, and he's doing it for a reason. Verse 11. The Jews were looking at him at the feast and saying, where is he? This wasn't a, where is he? I want to worship him. This wasn't a, where is he? I want to get an autograph signed. This was a, where is he? We want to kill him. And this is the first response to King Jesus, is you hate him and you want him destroyed. That's the first response. And there are going to be people in here who you look at this and say, you know what? This Jesus guy sounds like a quack. It sounds like he's not protecting people. I'm going to protect myself. You guys are on your own, and I'm going to do it to my best ability, and I think I could cover it better than Jesus. And I'm like, okay, that works until death. Then what do you do? Are you really resting in your effort, your will? Well, I don't believe anything happens. Really? You don't believe anything happens? There's nothing nudging in your heart or soul that says you were made for more than just dust? Be honest with yourself. You owe it. Your life is that important. And some of you come in here and you're not there. You're not like, okay, I'm against Jesus, but you come like the crowd. Verse 12, and there was much muttering about him among the people. And some said, he's a good man. Others said, no, he's leading people astray. And here you see two responses of the crowd. One crowd is like, he's a good man, but he's not Savior. People come in church all the time like that. Oh, I love Jesus. I'll sing praise. I'll listen to the sermon. But he's actually not King and Lord over you. And right now, it's like, let the work of God work on you. Don't walk out thinking, I'm just playing the game. But some are like the other crowd where it's, no, I think he's leading people astray. You're not necessarily out for blood, but you're not very much in his camp. The crowd response can sometimes be, I'm against him. It can sometimes be for him. But the thing that combines the crowd is neither of them believe in him as Savior. There's one more response, but I want you to see that two of the responses we see to Jesus, total unbelief and want to murder him. The other is belief and I'm okay with him or I'm not okay with him. This last response comes from chapter 6, out of the mouth of Peter. Verse 68, it says this, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And we have believed, and we have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Do you hear the desperation in Peter's voice? Jesus, what you've said is hard, but where else can I go? Where else is there truth? Where else can I run? Christian, if you will have those moments, don't feel like something's wrong. That's the path of Jesus. When you, in that moment of desperation, cry out, I don't know what's going on, but Lord, I know you do. And you're my only hope. Watch what he'll do. Watch what he'll do in those moments. As I sat there after that 3-hour meeting and they sent me home, they had a 4-hour deliberation afterwards. They were up until Lord knows when. And the next day, my pastor calls me in. He's like, well, the elders don't see it. I can't fire you. And then we proceeded to have a really awkward 1.5-hour conversation. Because he didn't trust me, but he couldn't fire me. I don't even know what we talked about. It was a weird conversation. And then that moment hit, and he broke down. And he began to cry. And he looked at me with tears in his eyes, saying, I am guilty of the very thing I was accusing you of. I've been working behind the scenes to undermine your name. And that moment changed a lot of things. You know what it didn't change? The years of hurt and pain. The years of distrust and mistrust. Those scars continue on, and I wish I could tell you that God fixes and heals all scars. He does in the end, but in this life, we live with those. There's things that people will do to us that you just don't overlook. It goes all the way down to the core. But you know what Jesus does do? Is he can renew your heart to give grace in those moments. You're never going to be best friends, but he can give you grace. And if you stick with him, even in those trials where everything's seemingly falling apart around you, be amazed how he shows himself and glorifies himself through people's mistrust in you. Because of that reconciliation, we were able to plant out of that church. They were one of the supporting churches for this. Yeah, it's an amazing story of redemption. He came with his wife and visited just a couple months ago. We had him over for lunch. Again, it doesn't mean best buds, we're hanging out, we're doing everything on the weekend, but it does mean he's telling a very different story than what I expected. Are we willing? Are we willing to look at Jesus like Peter looked at Jesus and say, wherever you go, where could we go? You have the words of life. And why is this so important, Flatiron? Because I'm utterly convinced we're already far bigger than we need to be for this world to be changed. When Jesus takes a hold of a group of men and women like we have here, and he purposes them, and he strengthens them, and he gets them together for his mission, watch out. Watch out. You're thinking, we don't have much power. No, and we don't need much power. He's got all of it. Well, I don't know if I always agree with everyone. And you're not going to. Do you trust in him? But don't you see the forces of evil around us and the darkness around us? I do. And his light will pierce that darkness in a way that darkness can't possibly understand. Because that darkness only thinks in the terms of power. It has no understanding of death and resurrection. So what I'm going to do now is give us an opportunity to respond through prayer. For those in here who don't know Jesus, to meet Jesus. Prayer doesn't save you, but it gives you an opportunity to express faith that does. And I'm going to ask for those who do know him to confess today before him and trust in him. Bow your heads with me. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for your word. I want to lift up those who don't know you, who are far from you, and they're doing their whole thing on their own, and there's tons of mistrust all littered through their life. Lord, I pray right now that your Spirit would make it very clear their greatest issue of mistrust is with you, and they need to confess you as King and Lord. They need to come to you on your terms and acknowledge you, that you are indeed the creator of this world, that your Son, Jesus, came here perfect, died the death we deserved, was buried in the tomb, and 3 days later rose again, conquering Satan, sin, and death. And then as they do that, they would recognize that they aren't needing to be perfect. You are. They're not needing to have it all together. They simply need to trust in the one who does. And that, Lord, by your grace and through your Spirit, you would change them to be men and women who follow you wherever you lead. I pray that right now. I pray for those in the household of God who are struggling with mistrust. They're in a scenario much like I was where it's just wrongly going after them. People are wrongly assuming, and they're starting to feel like they have to get into the defensive posture, or they're having to protect themselves. Lord, remind them it is your strength alone that will carry them through. Lord, I pray for those who are in that season where people mistrust, and it's for good reason. They're not trustworthy. Lord, would they confess their sin before you, and would they be men and women who are trustworthy? Father, for those of us in this room who are going through seasons where we're the ones mistrusting people, for reasons outside of their own actions, or maybe we can justify it, but if we're honest, our heart has been suspicious towards them for a while. May we confess that before you, and may we confess that to them. May we bring that to them. Would you give us strength and peace and courage to do so, even if they don't respond well to it, knowing that you can still work through it. And Father, for those of us who mistrust and distrust rightly because we have been betrayed, we've seen what has happened, Lord, even there, let our hearts not grow accustomed to distrust, but let them grow in trust of you, that you will put us around people, place us in scenarios where even misuse can happen, but that you can glorify your name through it. Jesus, protect your church, protect your bride. Allow Flatiron to be faithful through the generations, that men and women may come to know you. I ask this in Christ's name.